Hi, everybody. I guess you know it's me. So this is the class for 19th century art number 3. This is the one that's due for Wednesday, April 15th. So I'm sorry I'm getting it to you a little bit late. And there will be um, probably 3 questions in here, maybe 4, but definitely 3. So we're going to start with the thing that really changed everything in art. We're going to start with photography. You're looking I'm talking about kind of the history of photography. You're looking at a print of one of the very earliest photographic prints by one of the fathers of modern photography, Louis-Jacques Mandé Daguerre. And you guys have maybe heard about daguerreotypes. This is a daguerreotype. It is called the Artist Studio. And we'll get to it in a minute. So first, I want to talk a little bit about photography and what photography is. It is the mechanical way that humans have figured out how to capture something that is outside in the world, whether it's people or objects or places, and capture it visually. There were there are definitely instances of people learning how to collect images. And one of the biggest ways that we know artists and other people were doing this was in the Renaissance, as far back as the Renaissance, using a thing called a pinhole camera. And you can set this up at home. You can set this up. You can set this up in a lot of ways. But basically, what will happen if you take a box and you put a pinhole in one side and point it towards whatever it is you want to look at, and then you let's say had a box that was big enough to fit your head inside of. If you were to turn around to look at the back of the box, the scene that's out in front of the hole would actually be projected on the back of the box upside down, which is very interesting, right? We have, I think, a pretty good evidence that there were artists like Vermeer who used pinhole cameras in their work in order to be accurate in their art. And so they wouldn't have been images that stayed or that were fixed in any way, but that they were just projected at the time in the pinhole camera. And so we see people trying to figure out how to capture images of the world around them, exact reproductions of those images for a really long time, hundreds of years. But in the middle 1800s, finally, some artists slash chemists learned how to capture the image and fix it onto a metal or glass plate through the use of light sensitive chemicals. And very soon after they were able to capture them on these plates, these metal or glass plates, they were able to capture them in such a way that they could also be printed on paper. Photography as an art furthered the objectivist or positive purpose of art, if you guys remember back in the Enlightenment, this is kind of the objectivists or the positivists were all about capturing what's out there in the world, recording nature, this scientific Enlightenment idea of recording nature as it is and learning from nature that way. So the earliest printed photography was done by this man, Louis-Jacques Daguerre, and another photographer named Joseph Niepce, and they used copper plates coated with iodized silver, which is light sensitive. This chemical developed an image on the plate when it was exposed to iodine fumes. So the silver exposed to iodine showed the image. And then he later learned how to fix that image. In other words, so if you expose it, the image appears on the plate, but if it keeps getting light on it, so you'd have to look at it in a dark room, as soon as you turn the light on, the image would completely overexpose and turn black. Unless they learned to fix it. So that within a dark room, they were able to capture the image on these plates, and then they learned to preserve that image and stop the exposure by bathing the image in a salt bath. This was later preserved by adding hypo, which actually reversed the light sensitive materials. so it would stop it, so it would hold the image forever. Daguerreo's science of photography was improved by Englishman William Fox Talbot with what he called the calotype, which was to use the light sensitive material to make a negative rather than a positive. And then through this negative, we could then print multiple images of the image. And that's how photography kind of came forward to us. Now we do it all digitally, which is completely different again. But back then, it very quickly went from positive being printed on a plate and glass to a negative being able to be printed on paper and being able to capture the image and freeze the image. So that's kind of the, I don't know, the easy scientific explanation of what could happen. So early photography could give people an accurate and absolutely detailed record of a scene, of a visual scene, whether it, like this piece, whether it was a collection like a still life of objects. Here's another, this is a painting of objects. That kind of gives you an idea of some of the objects that people might paint to talk about their interests. As you can see in this one, the interests are kind of classical. Here's a classical figure. Here's a kind of a cast of a ram. So it kind of refers to classical images and education. Here's another one. This one's by Henry Fox Talbot. It's called The Open Door. And so this is just more of an everyday kind of scene. But photography was just miraculous to people at that time. It was able to capture every detail. The one thing that they didn't have and they couldn't do yet was capture color. And that developed eventually, but not yet. So it did not take very long before it quickly advanced from being a device, kind of a scientific device used to capture the outside world, to becoming a device that could be used as an artist, that could be used to look at the world in a certain way. So I want you to think a little bit about, I'm going to ask you a question about this now. And I want you to tell me, I mean, no matter what, if you point a camera at something and you take a picture of it, you're going to capture the details of what are in front of you. But as an artist, how can you manipulate what you're capturing? So let's think back to that time when they would have had limited materials. They wouldn't have had, fancy lenses. They don't have colored photography. They just have this very simple camera. What are ways that a photographer / artist could manipulate the image? And so I want you to stop here and give me one or two examples of the way an artist or photographer could manipulate an image. Let's say 10 photographers are looking at this very image, this image of the door. What are different ways that the photographer could change, or add their point of view or their artistic eye to that image to make it uniquely theirs? Because I think a lot of people think photography doesn't have an artistic point of view, and I would like to argue against that. Okay, so let's move on to a couple other of these early photographs. One of this is a really nice, beautiful image of the exact plate that was printed, and you can see that it's a kind of a sepia or brown in color. One of the most common ways and the best ways that photography was used early on was with portrait photography. This is a daguerreotype of Samuel Finley Breese Morse of Morse code, and this was a way that kind of relatively inexpensive. So this was early. It was 1845. This was a way that people could record their own image And no longer do you need to have the expense of having an artist come and paint you, but you could sit with for a photographer and almost instantly have your image recorded. So this was a real, almost a real threat uh, to to uh, to painters, because all of a sudden now this new art form could capture people's likeness much quicker, much easier, much cheaper, and absolutely exactly as they looked, which was very appealing to people. It became very popular right away. Another another important use of photography was to document history. And this is a photograph by Edouard Denis Baldus. It's called House with Staircase, and it was a recording of one of the houses in France, one of the grand chateaux that was taken down during the construction in Paris of the Champs-Élysées. There were many great Parisian houses that were sacrificed at the time when the Champs-Élysées was built. And so Baldus was one of the photographers who decided to document these homes before they were demolished, which is kind of interesting. And you might also guess that that another important use of photography early on was to document war. The first really, really big war that was well documented by photography was the United States Civil War. This is a photograph by Timothy O'Sullivan called The Home of the Rebel Sharpshooter, Battlefield at Gettysburg in 1863. There were many photographers present at the Civil War recording the carnage that happened at this war. One of the reasons this war was so keenly felt at home was not only because it killed a bunch of Americans, but also because the families who were left behind actually later on could see images of just how ugly the death was. Fields covered with bodies, and just the gruesome way that bodies were left strewn all over the place, how many people died and how hard that looked. Now, one of the things about this particular photograph that I think is kind of interesting, you can see that it's set inside of this bunker, and here's a soldier that has been killed in the bunker. But in fact, it's not a candid shot. Timothy O'Sullivan set this up to have a better composition with the body and the gun. So he moved objects around in order to get a better composition, in his opinion. And so this was, so this was a rearranged or organized to get a better composition. But photography had a huge impact on people in this particular war. Photography also, interestingly, was used. People tried to make it be like painting, be like art. And this is a later piece done in 1857 by photographer artist Oscar Rylander called The Two Paths of Life. You can see that it's a little bit set up like Raphael's School of Athens. And we see on the right side the life of goodness, and the left side is the life of debauchery and badness. So the path to heaven versus the path to hell. And he managed to create this print by actually combining a bunch of different photographs together, in actually doing it in the darkroom by adding individual. So one room, many individual shots of people in the same photograph. It would have been a pretty complicated process, but that was something that he was able to do. And it's kind of interesting because it feels so contrived, I think, to us compared to a painting that might feel a little bit less contrived. So it's kind of interesting how photography how in this case he kind of warped it to try to make it more like painting rather than the other way around. I'm going to show you a few more. I'm going to show you the work of another artist that was pretty famous and very successful at the very end of the 19th century. And this was the photographer Julia Margaret Cameron. This is a portrait that she made of Thomas Carlyle. Cameron was an interesting woman. She was I think, an upper middle class woman whose children gave her a camera, which was a kind of a novelty. They were wealthy enough to afford this camera when they were grown, and Julia Marie Margaret Cameron, was older. So she was probably like in her early 50s or so when or maybe even 40s, when her children gifted her this camera. And she started taking. She was running in pretty elite social circles, and so she took a lot of pictures of her family, her friends, like Thomas Carlyle, and she became renowned for her ability to capture emotion, and also for her kind of almost wistful, slightly out of focus, uh, kind of spiritual quality that she was able to capture in her photography. I think mainly Cameron did a couple of things. Interestingly, she would often shoot at very close proximity, and then she would cause the focus to be a little bit out of focus by using a variety of means, like some gauze over the lens, or maybe some like substance like oil on the lens to give it a softer focus, which is kind of interesting. Here is another Cameron. And here you can see the real romantic quality. These weren't famous people. These were people women in her social circle and her family. Very, very romantic. All right. This is a portrait of Charles Baudelaire, a famous writer, by the photographer Nadar. And he called himself Nadar, but he was actually named Gaspard Félix Tournachon, and Nadar was the photographer in Paris. He photographed everybody, and I think it's interesting. One of the things that people liked about Nadar's photographs and his portraits was that they actually kind of told a lot about the person. Not only did he capture their likeness and maybe their way of looking into the camera, but the way that he focused in, the way that he gave them, the clothing they wore, and the way that he captured the image of their face, said a lot about what kind of a person they are. So this was Baudelaire, and this is. Oh my gosh, this is a famous actress at the time whose name I'm so sorry I'm forgetting. But you can see that she's also being shown in this kind of very dramatic way, and that she is I'll remember her name in another minute. It'll just come to me. But she was captured, Sarah Bernhardt. And Sarah Bernhardt, okay, I remembered. That's good. She's also being shown in this kind of slightly risque way, with this loose-fitting garment, kind of being just draped across her shoulder. So not really this big formal fancy dress, tight button corset, but in a much more artsy way. And Nadar captured her like that. So we're going to transition now to Honoré Daumier, who was a printmaker, French. And the piece that's on the AP is actually this. Oh, I'm going to go right here. It's right here. It's this Daumier print of Nadar. It's about the photographer Nadar. And as you can see, it's kind of interesting. It shows Nadar up in a balloon taking pictures over France. And you can see that below the balloon, just about every building has a photographic shop in it. It was a rage, and it was completely taking over all of Paris, and everybody and their brother was opening up a photographic shop. Nadar was extremely successful at the time, and so Daumier is making a little bit of fun of that he is exploiting this. But I think it also speaks to, it's a really great print that tells us a little bit about the importance of photography at the time. The name of this is Nadar Raising Photography to the Height of Art. And I think that was meant as a tongue-in-cheek thing. Because I think there were many people that felt that photography could never reach the peak or the height of art. And I think A Daumier would definitely be one of those people. Daumier, here's another piece of another lithograph by Daumier. This one's called Rue Transnonain, 15th of April, 1834. Um, so Daumier was a printmaker. He was a painter too, but he was primarily a printmaker. And you might remember that printmaking was one of the ways that artists could get multiple images out to many, many people. This print was done around the same incidents that Liberty Leading the People was done, around that same French governmental crackdown, where they were going in and pulling people out of their bedrooms, out of their houses, in their nightshirts and killing them. And this is a documentation of an event that really happened. And here you can see a husband and wife and their children, and maybe even a grandfather who've been slaughtered in their own home. And you can see the father, who's lying prominently in the middle, has been killed and has fallen down onto the body of his little daughter, which is pinned underneath him. It's really quite awful. And this is a good. This is a good print to know that Daumier did this kind of thing as well, because not only was Daumier poking fun at things like photography, which was all the rage, but he was also all about social justice, just like the Romantics were at the time. And here's another Daumier. This is called Third Class Carriage. It's a scene taking place in a, I think it would be I'm not sure if it's a train yet. I guess it must have been a train. Sure, it's a train. It's a train carriage. And you can see the third class, which is the lower class, or the folks that are facing us, and they're kind of dressed more shabbily. But you can see that they're kind of organized in a little pyramid. They're huddled together. They look close. They look poor, but they look happy. They look connected. But if you look behind them in this first class or second class area, the higher class area, you can see that the people all are individually apart from one another in their own little silos. They're not connected with one another. They might have nicer clothes, but their lifestyle isn't as good. They don't have the joy and the happiness that the people who live a simpler life have. And so this was part of Daumier's message. Okay, so I'm going to move us past Daumier, and we are going to go talk about the new art. All right. Okay, so photography. I gave you a pretty quick overview of photography. And at the time, photography in and of itself was interesting. And I'm not going to ask you a question about Nadar, so don't worry about that. I mean, I think I've asked you a question about photography, and photography was interesting in its own right, but it was an early art form, and it was still growing at this point. And so it would later, of course, go on to develop into a full-blown, really fantastic art form. And even some of the early artists were really pretty amazing. But I don't think I don't think it's the great art of photography that has the big impact. I think that on the art world, I think it's not that the photography was better than the painting or anything like that. I think it was just the event of photography, the fact that people could now get an image of themselves. They could get an image of anything around them. They could use a photograph to record the real world, and it just changes. It changes the world of painting. It's like, why do we need painters if photographers can do the same thing more accurately and cheaper? The only thing that photography couldn't do that painting could do was add color. And so painters, I don't know if there was a big discussion amongst painters, but the fact that photography happened and it was available and it was out there absolutely shifted the way painters thought. No longer was their job to just record objectively the world outside of them or idealize this, this client or this commissioner. They all of a sudden, we start seeing artists taking a really different point of view. And I need to talk with you a little bit about that point of view. So as we're moving down around middle of the 1800s, we see the generation of painters that follow the realists and that follow photography move away from social consciousness. They're not necessarily using art as a way to, fight a cause or like that. And they start thinking more about the form of their art. They start transforming the focus of painting away from the subject, like portrait, landscape, political, whatever. They started focusing away from the subject and towards the act of painting itself, towards the style, towards the application of paint, towards what they could do to manipulate it to become unique. It was not just, though, the act of painting, it was the act of seeing itself, the act of creating. And so the artist's job no longer was to just record what was out there, because that could be done by the camera. Now the artist's job is to add their own point of view, to start letting us see the landscape or the portrait or the objects through the filter of the artist's mind. And so we see this complete shift in the way that artists are viewing art and what their job as artists is. So the landscape or the portrait or whatever becomes merely the beginning point for a composition and not the end. It's not about reproducing the landscape, but about filtering it through that lens. So one of the early artists of this you're looking at is Whistler. His name is Joseph, I think, Whistler. He was an American. He was an expatriate. He worked primarily in England. And he thought that art wasn't about, this object or that object, but it was about composition. He was very influenced by Japanese prints, which were coming into Europe at this time. And the Japanese prints were showing a style that was very flattened and very designy. And he liked this idea. And for instance, this one is a portrait of his mother, but he didn't say portrait of mom as the title. He called the title Arrangement in Gray and Black. What he was interested in were the shapes and the forms and how they interplayed with one another. So this is very abstract thinking. Here's another Whistler I'm going to show you. This one is called Nocturne in Black and Gold, or The Falling Rocket. And when you're looking at this at first, you think like, oh, like, what is this? Because it's really hard to tell, right? It's so abstract. And when this, in fact, first came out, a critic from one of the newspapers called it, thought maybe that Whistler had a fit and dropped his pot of paint and just splashed paint up on the canvas, and said that it was just this horrible mistake of a painting. And of course, Whistler was really insulted by that, and he actually sued the paper and won for defamation. Unfortunately for him, I think he won like £1 or £1 or whatever, very small amount. So the courts gave it to him, but they didn't give him much. All right, so Whistler was an early adopter of this idea of thinking about the artist as having a creative eye. And we're gonna go into that a little bit more with this guy. All right, and we'll get here. Boop, there we go. This is a really important painting by the French artist Edouard Manet. It's called Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, which means luncheon on the grass. It's a large painting. It's an oil on canvas. It's 7 feet by 8'8", and it was painted in 1863. And you can look at it and say, well, that looks like a pretty regular painting. What's so striking or original about that? I'm going to help you look at that and see, and I'm going to help you see, maybe hopefully help you see it a little bit differently. because I think it's with Manet and Manet's force and his will around the work he was doing at this time that he starts taking a group of painters and leading them towards a different way of being and a different way of seeing the world and seeing the job of the painter. Manet was an upper middle class man. His early training was traditional and academic. His family, of course, didn't want him to be a painter, but he did. He went to the academy. He fought against the constraint of all the classical poses and the unnatural lighting. He wanted to depict his model in more naturalistic ways under everyday circumstances. He felt, okay, now this is an important thing. So he was a follower of the poet Baudelaire, who we just saw a photograph of. Okay, here catch this. This is the quote, that the infinite could be captured in the moment. The infinite can be captured in the moment. All right, what does that mean? I think that's an important question. How can the infinite be captured in a moment? What is the infinite? It's everything, right? It's everything, all things, all time, all space, all the infinite. How can the infinite be captured in a moment? And this is what Manet sought to do. So I want you guys to take a stab at it. Write down right now your idea. It can just be a couple of sentences, or you can record it into VoiceThread. How does one capture the infinity, the infinite, in one moment? How can that be done? What is he thinking? What does he mean by that? So answer me that question. So that's your question number 2. All right. So I'm going to show you what after that. Now you'll come back to this. I'm going to switch us over to another painter. We're going to come back to this, but Manet was very influenced by Titian. You guys might recognize this painting as by Titian. It was a pastoral painting by him, and he was very influenced by this painting in particular because it was an allegory. So Titian didn't make this painting to record a scene that was in front of him. This was a painting which was an allegory of art and music. And you can see these 2 gentlemen sitting here, and they're clothed, and they have women with them who are very classical looking, who are not clothed, which is kind of weird, right? It seems weird. I mean, here these guys are dressed and looking normal, and these women are just standing there like nothing, wearing no clothes. Well, Titian, back in the Renaissance, Titian's idea was that these 2 women were allegorical figures for the arts, for music. And so these 2 are young men who are creating music together. And these 2 represent that creative process. So these are imaginary women that Titian has put into the scene, which are meant to capture the imagination of these 2 artists as they make music. So Manet kind of used Titian's thought of using this allegorical figure as a way that he could approach the art. And now his figures are not allegorical figures. They're real figures that are sitting here in this picnic in the woods with these 2 dressed gentlemen. So we've got one totally nude woman and a woman that's clearly kind of wearing just like a dressing gown or some light garment that's not normal clothing of an upper class woman, and sitting here with having lunch or hanging out with these guys that are definitely kind of upper class. And with this painting and using the inspiration of Titian, Manet was trying to blur the boundary between the objective and the subjective. Okay, the objective and the subjective. What is that? The camera captures the world objectively, right? So that's objective, recording what's out there. You and I agree, the sky is blue and the ocean is a different color blue. We agree on all these things. We call this the objective view of the world, right? The scientific recording of what's out there. But then what's the subjective? And what does that have to do with the world around us? Well, I have a question for you. And you don't need to write the answer to this down. Just I want you to think about it. Do you think that I perceive what I see in front of me the same way that you do? Do you think you see the world exactly the same way I do? One has to just take one quick look at the panel of a Zoom chat to know that it isn't true. I see my right hand going up when you see my left hand. So what I'm seeing is different from what you're seeing. And in many subtle ways, this is true across the board. And Manet realized this. Manet realized, a painting isn't an objective recording of the world around us. A painting is a world that the artist is going to create inside of his head and then put out onto the canvas. This is the painter's world. So I get to put my point of view on the painting. I get to pick what colors go on there, where the people go, what it looks like. This is my little world. This is my subjective view of this scene. And I can manipulate it however I want to. And this was a revelation. People hadn't thought of doing this before. Artists thought they always had to be true to the outside world. And you can see that Manet is also being pretty true to the outside world. I think we would all agree that there are two men in this, and there are two women in this, and there is food in this, et cetera, et cetera. But what I want you to do now is I want you to answer me this question. So I want each of you guys to write down maybe two ways in which Manet is manipulating this painting and to show his subjective view of the world. And there's a whole bunch of ways he's doing that. I want you to notice the different painting styles. I want you to look at proportion. I want you to notice how he has placed people and how he's placed all the elements of the painting. Remember, this is his little world that he's manipulating to make it his view, his subjective view of the world, and to give us, the viewer, his point of view, which is subjective. And in his mind, he was trying to capture this little moment in time, which could maybe capture infinity. Okay, so take a moment, write down some ways that you see that Manet has blurred the boundary between objective and subjective. You can see he hasn't broken from objectivity. We still see these objects, but how has he blurred that boundary? How has he manipulated this painting? And there's a whole bunch of interesting ways. And when we start looking at it, it's like, wow, he definitely manipulated it. It's so interesting. So, you can think about the objective things that we've been studying, and now we're looking, at something that would be objectively the outside subject matter, but now he's realizing I get to have my subjective point of view, because honestly, objectively, what is a canvas? What is it? It's a flat piece of fabric that's covered with paint. That's all it is. It appears to be something else. It's an illusion of something else. But it's actually just a flat surface that an artist has put color on. And Manet starts getting this. He's like, yeah, this is an illusion. I'm not painting reality. I'm painting an illusion of reality. Why do I have to be true to that, what I see outside? Why can't I be true to me and what I want to see? All right. So I know this painting doesn't seem that crazy, but when you really start looking in the different ways that he's manipulated the elements in this painting, you can see that it doesn't mirror outside reality. Notice the different ways that he's painted the people, the different ways he's painted the different parts of the landscape. even the different ways he's painted the objects, like the fruit and the cloth and stuff that's in the foreground. They're all painted in very deliberate ways. And none of them really seek to mimic the outside world. They're recognizable to us, but they don't look like the world around us, each in their own way. So I want you to list those things that he's done. Okay, because this painting, I think, almost reads as a manifesto for artistic freedom at the time. And his point was, I'm not fighting for rights or freedom or political correctness. This subject matter doesn't even matter. What really matters is the painting, this world that I'm creating. What matters is my subjective act as an artist. I'm painting this for aesthetic effect alone, not for the meaning of the subject matter. Does that make sense? I'm interested in the aesthetics. What does it look like? What does it appear? How does it make you feel? Do you feel that feeling of the infinite in that moment? All right. So I'm not gonna go through all the ways that he's subjectively altered this image to help us realize that this is not an imitation of life. I want you to do that. Okay, so his choices, though, were all deliberate. And the first loyalty of Manet was neither to the past, what has happened before, or the present subject matter, but to his canvas, what's in front of him, and what it would look like, and how he could manipulate all the elements to get this thing that he wanted to be, the thing, what the thing that he wanted it to be. So this is the beginning of art for art's sake, not for any other purpose besides the artist's intention. You've heard of this thing, art for art's sake? Here's where it starts. So this painting, the Déjeuner sur l'herbe, was rejected from the Paris Salon. They're pretty conservative, makes sense. It was rejected from the Paris Salon of 1863. A huge outcry of protest erupted, mainly from the art world, prompting Napoleon III to open another show next to the regular salon, called the Salon des Refusés, or the refused ones, which is kind of that's a little bit insulting, all right? But in fact, very quickly, it became clear to all the elite in Paris that the interesting art was in the Salon de Refusés, not the regular salon. And so actually, this is the place, this is the Salon de Refusés, all the work that didn't get accepted into the regular Academy show, that started catching on and started really becoming the rage, and actually caused this regular salon to eventually, after a few years, close because nobody was interested in it. It's really kind of interesting how it happened. So Manet's painting was included in this reject show and was met by absolute outrage by the public, completely outraged. Yeah. So what do you think why do you think the public was outraged? Answer me that question on the slide. So that's question number 4, or maybe 5. Why was the public outraged? And you can imagine it's not rocket science. It wasn't such a big shift aesthetically, but the subject matter is kind of controversial. I mean, I think just looking at Manet's model would really get you there. The other thing about it, of course, is that they just hated the fact that this woman looked so calm and comfortable and completely unembarrassed by the situation. All right, and also in this painting, Manet sprinkled a bunch of symbolism that was symbolic for the conflict between the spirit and the flesh. Because this was another one of the ways that he was trying to manipulate the canvas, but also include the subject matter of the eternal and the moment. And so it's sacred and profane, the spirit and the flesh, because he could do this. In the clothed background, figure, the one that's, I'll manipulate here. This woman who's in what appears to be a body of water is being looked down upon by by a bird, which is a symbol for purity. The nudes garments here, this nudes garments here, um, are attended by a frog. So there's a frog sitting in the garments. And this is a symbol of the flesh, which is kind of interesting. So he's kind of pitting the two female figures against each other. All right. So this was Manet's early break, and then he kept going forward, and he collected a lot of followers. Most notably were the Impressionists, who found his work really, really, really intriguing, and they loved him. This is Manet's portrait of Emile Zola. The writer Emile Zola, and you can see here that he has included another painting by Manet, as well as some Japanese prints, which were very popular at the time. And here's some copy of Japanese prints that were circulating in Europe at this time. And you can see that one of the things that the Europeans must have loved about these Japanese prints was the fact that they were so flat and so designy, and they didn't care about traditional volume or space or motion, things like that the Europeans were so concerned with. This was a real revelation to the Europeans. And also the way that the Japanese would crop things, like just crop things right out of the edge. They'd zoom in so tight that they would crop things, and that was another revelation. Another thing they loved about the Japanese was the point of view, that they would take really unique points of view and show it to us from this way. This is another one of, oh gosh, I'm sorry, I forgot his name. Point of view of Mount Fujiyama, taken from the middle of the ocean, which is kind of interesting. All right. So this is, I believe, this is the AP piece of Manet's. This is called Olympia. I'm sure it looks really familiar to you because you guys have studied Titian's Venus. And this is Goya's Maha, which was also done earlier, done during Goya's time, about 100 years earlier. And this is Titian's done in the Renaissance. And these were both influential of Manet. And you can see that Manet really took a lot of the same elements of Titian's work and put it in his, but totally changed it. I mean, so we've got the same nude woman reclining kind of on a bed. We've got the kind of screen right in the middle that's slicing right through the middle and comes down right at her groin, just like Titian's does. But the two women have such a different look, don't they? So Manet's woman she was actually, her name was Olympia. She was a very high-priced prostitute in Paris. And as you can see, she's bringing this maid of hers is bringing her a big, giant bouquet of flowers that obviously somebody that she might have been out with earlier that evening before has given to her. And she doesn't seem to be paying any notice. You might also notice that the dog that the Venus has at her feet has been replaced by kind of a spooked cat. It's a little bit of a play on words. And of course the cat, symbolizes the feminine mystique versus the dog, which represents the fidelity, which is interesting. And of course, Olympia would not have any fidelity. So this is a really interesting piece because it is a take on this, but it's painted in such a different way. So first, I'm going to stop and let you guys answer the question: how has Manet really updated this woman? How is she super different from the Venus? Tell me everything you can think of. Please, each of you list two things. Look at each other's answers so that you don't repeat them all. But tell me ways in which Manet has updated the female form. And I want you to tell me both in terms of style and in terms of content. What's his meaning? How's his meaning different? And how does he show us that with his style? And stylistically, what are his concerns? They're really different. The way she's depicted is so different from the way Titian depicts the Venus. So I want you to compare and contrast them a little bit. How has he updated her, right? And I'm not even going to go into this. So one of the things I am going to say, though, is one of Manet's points, besides being a little bit shocking and painting this courtesan in this very large painting and not a Venus, or not, painting this nude, shameless image of a courtesan, is that he's also wanting us to look, make us understand that this is a painting. It's not a depiction of something real. But it's a fictional depiction. It's a flat thing, and he doesn't want to paint illusions. He wants to paint what it is, which is a painting, which is definitely interesting. Okay, so I'm going to leave you here with that answer. You guys are going to fill out all the ways that he has modernized it in terms of content and style. All right, and we're gonna talk about one more painting of Manet's before I close with Manet. This is a later painting of Manet's. I adore this painting. You can see that his style has changed a lot at this point. This one is 20 years down the line. It was painted during 1881 and 1882. It's called The Bar at the Folies Bergères, which was it was like a nightclub kind of bar. And you can see that there's a bartender standing looking at us. And one of the things you might notice right away is his color palette has changed entirely. And his color palette has grown because the painters around him have pushed him. So he started the whole thing with his subjective view of reality. And since then, we've had Renoir and Monet and Degas and all of these other Impressionist painters pick up their brushes and start their own subjective way of painting. And this loose brushwork and brighter, colorful style of painting comes back and influences Manet. And Manet's new later work is very much influenced by the Impressionists and their palette and their brushwork. And I think that's easy to see here. Okay, so that's that note. But I want to get to the meaning because I love this painting for its meaning. And I love how it's this, what's real? What's real? This is a painting. Is this real or is that real? And this one really plays with what is real. So you can let's start from the bottom and work up. You can see that we've got our barmaid. She's leaning on a marble bar top that has fruit on it and some bottles of probably champagne. You can look up and see, you can see her figure. She's got her hands on the bar, and she's kind of standing there looking like she's zoning out. Can you see how she's kind of like zoning out? Her eyes aren't focused. They're looking a little bit down and slightly off to the side. And I want you to look behind her. And you can see that there's another table where there are maybe some more alcohol drinks, etc. Some other drinks or something behind her. But then you might say, oh, wait a minute. Maybe those aren't other drinks behind her. Maybe that isn't another drink behind her. Yeah, no, it's not. If you look down by her wrist, you can see a kind of a gold line, which is the molding of the wall behind her. And everything above that gold strip right by her wrist is a mirror. Yeah, so what we're looking at, the marble that's behind her is a reflection of the marble that's in front of her. And the bottles on the table are the bottles that we see on the bar in front of her. And so if you look behind the table and the bottles behind her, reflected behind her, then you get a view of the bar itself that's out in front of her, what she is looking at. The greater bar, it's full of people. You can see the great chandelier. And if you look up in the far, I'm maybe pointing in the wrong way, the far upper left corner of the painting, you actually see two little feet in green shoes standing on a trapeze. And this was true of the Folies Bergères, was that they would have trapeze artists swinging above the crowds as part of entertainment. And so this was the kind of gay, happy, upper class party life of Parisian, Paris, the nightlife of Paris. Very, very happy, right? Okay, so that's all pretty straightforward. Bartender, bar, mirror. The mystery comes in the right side. So you can see that I'm sorry, that you can see that the figure that's just to the right of our bartender facing us is her reflection from behind. Okay, so there she's looking at us, and right to her to her right is what is her reflection from behind. So because of course she's standing in front of the mirror, so of course it would show her backside. And it's very interesting because look at what the mirror shows us. It shows us that she is talking to a gentleman who is standing very, very close to her. Look at how close his face is to her, right? And look at her position. Look at the way that the reflection shows her kind of leaning into the bar, kind of having a close tete-a-tete with the gentleman in the hat. And it makes you wonder, like, well, where is the gentleman in the hat? Because we don't see him from our point of view. And it makes you wonder, well, are we the gentleman in the hat standing there talking to the bartender? But look at her. She doesn't look engaged. Look at her reflection. Look at how she's leaning in and talking to him, almost like whispering or having a close conversation. But look at the way she's looking at us, the viewer. She's bored. So interesting. So are we the man in the hat? Or is the man in the hat not, something else in this painting? Is he in her imagination? We don't know, because the intimate conversation that seems to be happening in the reflection is definitely not happening in between us, the viewer, and the barmaid in front of us. She's bored. She's checked out. She is, her mind is off somewhere else. But Manet shows a different scene happening in the reflection. So it's a question, it's what's reality here? Is it what we see in front of us or what we see in the mirror? Kind of interesting, and very Manet, because he can manipulate this because he's the artist. It doesn't have to be reality. He can make it say what he wants it to say. All right, that's the end. And